Saturday Night Live's Pete Davidson drawing backlash after making fun of Dan Crenshaw. He is a former Navy SEAL turned Republican congressional candidate in Texas who lost his eye from a homemade landmine explosion in Afghanistan. Watch this.
This guy's kind of cool, Dan Crenshaw.
Oh, come on, man.
Yo, hold on. You may be surprised to hear he's a congressional candidate from Texas and not a hitman in a porno movie. I'm sorry, I know he lost his eye in war or whatever.
Joining us now is Dan Crenshaw, the Republican candidate for Texas's 2nd congressional district. Good morning, Mr. Crenshaw.
Good morning, Allison. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you. What did you think when you heard that you were featured on SNL?
Well, you know, the first part of that skit was just strange. I don't know what kind of programs that he's watching. The second part, I think, is when it just became dark. And listen, as we have thick skin, but as veterans, it's hard for us to understand why war wounds would elicit such raucous laughter from an audience. And so I think they should have rethought that joke a little bit, if you could even call it a joke.
So listen, here's what people need to know. You are a Navy SEAL. You did 5 tours of duty. You lost your eye after being hit by an IED in Helmand province in 2012. You've received the Purple Heart, 2 Bronze Stars, a Medal with Valor. You could squash Pete Davidson like a grape, obviously, okay? So, I mean, it's not even a fair fight, right? He's punching up. No. So what do you want from him this morning?
Well, you know, yeah, everybody's asking that. Like, do you demand an apology from this man? I do not demand an apology. He probably should apologize, but I don't want some hollow apology. I think he's exposed himself. I think he's exposed himself for who he really is. You know, I wish him well. I think what him and maybe the producers at SNL should do is pool their money together. Let's throw a figure out there, $1 million, and we will donate that to a series of veterans nonprofits that helps veterans. Maybe the Navy SEAL Foundation, maybe Wounded Warriors, maybe Folds of Honor. I was just at their benefit last night. There's a lot of great organizations out there. There's a lot of veterans that really need help, and frankly, you know, this kind of thing is offensive to them. They feel laughed at.
Okay, so that's really interesting. I mean, I don't know that Pete Davidson has $1 million, but we'll see what SNL comes up with, and if SNL heeds your call to do something. Meanwhile, while I have you, I do want to ask you about some veterans issues. As
Sure.
you know, President Trump has been talking a lot on the campaign trail about this migrant crisis, as he calls it, this group of migrants from Central America that are still roughly 1,000 miles away from our border. But he is saying that he'd like to send 15,000 troops to the southern U.S. border. That's more than are in Afghanistan. There's 14,000. More than are in Iraq, 5,200. Do you think that's appropriate?
Well, I think the president and his advisors need to come up with any way necessary to make sure that 10,000 people don't break down our barriers the way they broke down the barriers on the Mexican southern border. We need to be working with Mexico on this issue, and we need to be monitoring it closely. So we need to do what is required. A lot of those troops are logistical in nature. They're there for medical reasons. They're there for housing reasons. They are building those 10 cities like the president talked about. The bottom line is this. We need to stop thousands of people from illegally crossing from one side of our border to the other. If you simply allow that to happen, or we pretend that there's just nothing to see down there, then we're setting a precedent. We're setting a dangerous precedent where there are no laws enforced in our country, and that is not sustainable. It's not sustainable for our law enforcement already trying to defend the border. It's not sustainable for our court systems that have to deal with illegal immigrants coming across. It's not sustainable for our schools when they put their children in schools or our emergency rooms.
And Mr. Crenshaw, I just want to fact check a little bit because just to be clear, our reporting from people journalists embedded with the migrants is that the numbers have dwindled. They're not 10,000. They've at last count dwindled to 3,500. But, you know, our border agents have processes. They have rules for when people present themselves at the border. It would not look like what happened in Mexico. I mean, they've dealt with this before, is my point. They've dealt with people
how do you know?
Well, because there were other so-called caravans in previous years that have shown up at the border, and we treated them like asylum seekers and processed them, and they were dealt with. So in other words, it wasn't a crisis by the time it showed up at our border.
And maybe it won't be this time either, but to not be prepared for it, I think would be a disservice to the American people.
Okay, next question. Are you comfortable with the fact that President Trump has not visited a military base in a combat zone since becoming president?
Well, you'll have to ask the president why or what benefit that would have for
No, they
the
did. We
military
did. And
base.
he said, hold on just 1 second. He said that at some point, I will do that at some point, but I don't think it's overly necessary. I've been very busy with everything here. So I'm just getting your take on, do you think he should do that?
As Commander-in-Chief, he is quite busy. I was in the military for 10 years. I never once saw any president visit a base that I was at, and I felt that I could do my job just fine.
But do you think that it helps morale when a U.S. president shows up at a military base in a combat zone?
It could help morale, but I will tell you this. I still keep in contact with a lot of the soldiers, the SEALs who are out there serving. Morale is actually very high. And the reason is this. The president gives our generals and our troops the ability to do the job, the ability to go forth with the mission that we have given them. It did not feel that way under the Obama administration, and I have to tell you the truth on that. It really didn't feel that way. Troops do feel like the president has their back, and morale is actually pretty high.
All right, Dan Crenshaw, thank you very much for your perspective, and thank you for your service. Great to have you on New Day.
Oh, thank you.